when you move too fast, you can't tune into what your heart wants. You can't tune into what your instincts want. And yeah, I would say that if I could, bring a slow startup building movement, like the slow food movement, I would, if you can. And if we live in a hustle culture, there's something magical about stepping back and really being conscious about what you're building.
What would you say to Erika 16 years ago?
Today and lately, what I've been reflecting on is that, as cliche as it sounds, everything does happen at its right time. Mm-hmm. And everything you do leads to whatever it is you're going to do next.
Hi Erika, welcome. We're here at the backstage at the Entrepreneur Sharjah Festival, and I'm delighted to have a bit of a conversation with you today.
Yay! Thanks, Kelly. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So this is your second time?
This is my second time at the Sharjah Entrepreneurship Festival.
And what are you being part of, apart from being backstage and sharing your knowledge, which I have a ton of questions to ask you, what else are you doing here at the festival?
Yeah, I'm moderating a few panels and speaking a little bit about Lucidity Insights this time. So it's great for me actually to be on this side, because last year I was on that side asking all these entrepreneurs a bunch of questions.
So let's set the scene then. For those that maybe don't know who you are or what it is that you do, can you give us a little bit of a backstory as to what got you here?
Yeah, so who's Erika Welch and why is she sitting here? So what's got me here, let's start there. I'm the Chief Content Officer and co-founder of Lucidity Insights. Mm-hmm. It's a data and insights platform specifically focused on providing techpreneurs in the Middle East and Africa access to data that really was only available to investors or consultants like me. I'm an ex-consultant myself. And basically Fortune 500 CEOs that would pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for it or millions of dollars for it. Yeah. And that's my passion at the moment, is educating startup founders, leveling up their fundraising game, leveling up their entrepreneurial knowledge base. And we're hoping Lucidity Insights is the platform to do that.
I love that. And you've traveled around a lot, your experience. How long have you been here in the Middle East, and how do you see this sort of entrepreneurship journey? So I've been here 20 years, so I've seen it grow a lot. What's your kind of journey?
I'm not quite there, but I was 16 years. Wow. I've been in the region. And I've built a few businesses here, sold them off, IPO'd some in Asia. But the Middle East has always been my base. And Dubai is such an interesting place. When I came in 2008, it was going through the financial crisis. Yeah. And startup stuff really wasn't happening. I was working a lot in Jordan at the time as well. Mm-hmm. And there was more of a startup scene in Jordan, would you imagine, than Dubai or Abu Dhabi for that matter. And now it's an entirely different ecosystem. I just love working in high growth markets. Asia Pacific obviously is going to harbor more than 70% of the world population in a few years. Yeah. And these are markets that are growing at a rate, I assume from your accent, you're from Western Europe.
Can you guess where?
Ireland?
Scotland.
Oh, close. God. I've made a fool of myself.
Not at all. It's easy done.
I'm Canadian and half Japanese. And so I come from these really interesting, mature markets, you would say. Yeah. And I would also say boring markets. A lot of people ask me why I'm out here. And I'm out here because this gives you access to these really interesting high growth markets that change so dramatically and so quickly in a very short period of time.
Why do you think that is? Is it because the opportunities are new and a lot of the infrastructure maybe isn't here? Or do you think it's more the mindset of the people that are coming?
You know what? It's a mix of all sorts of things. So at the beginning, I would say, first of all, I would say when we talk about a big enough region like the Middle East and Africa, and then I include Pakistan and Turkey into that, there are so many countries in that, right? We're talking about over 75 countries. This is a
tiny part of it in comparison.
Right. This is a significant part of the world. And when you look at the UAE or the GCC countries, also very different. We have a market that's very much like Western Europe. salaries are quite high here. The propensity to pay is quite easeful. The infrastructure is here. I mean, they built Dubai Internet City in the year 2000, 25 years ago. So the infrastructure has been here. We're usually the first adopters of 5G internet, 4G internet, now 5G. And in this part of the world, in the GCC, in Dubai, in the UAE, you have all of the components that Silicon Valley has. And I would know because I lived in Silicon Valley for a time as well. In fact, I remember being at Stanford Business School and thinking, gosh, is this Silicon Valley? Because we were trying to order funny anecdote, order pizza off of an app, as you do, and the pizza didn't arrive for an hour. They got lost. The internet connectivity wasn't great in Silicon Valley. And I was like, how can it be Silicon Valley? And they have like black spots for internet. So, and that wasn't that long ago. That was 2017. So,
oh, wow.
So, yeah. So all of that to say, we have to treat Middle East and Africa and this part of the world, we really have to look at it country by country basis. But I would say, let's talk about Dubai because this is where we're here, where we are. Dubai attracts people that are hustlers. Dubai attracts people that are opportunists, that want to be future focused. And that creates a great entrepreneurial environment. And just a little anecdote on that, actually 1 in 5 people in Dubai that are residents of Dubai, so not residents of Sharjah and Abu Dhabi and all these, but just Dubai, have a business registered under their name.
Oh, that's it. I never knew that.
1 in 5. So just think, of course, there's people that have day jobs and they've still stayed on that corporate ladder, but they've got a business on the side. And that's the type of city Dubai is. And so in that sense, I think it's been a magnificent, 15, 16 years that I've been here to see like momentous change.
Yeah, I think about my friendship circle actually, and all my friends own businesses, so maybe that's less in the 5, but then in other groups and communities, that's fascinating. Yeah. So there's loads of advantages, but with advantages and fast moving, there's always challenges. And what would you say have been some of the data-led challenges that have gone with the highs, I suppose, as well?
Absolutely. I mean, if you're working in a market like in Western European markets or Canada or the US, a lot of data and insights that you're looking for is available. If you want to start up a food tech company tomorrow, you can look it up and all that information is pretty reliable and pretty available. In emerging markets, that's not the case. And that's where Lucidity Insights, the idea for it came. And we're like, it's such a black box in emerging markets. You actually need consultants and data scientists to go out there, interview people in the field. It's really investigative work. And then pull together this data from all of the different sources, validate it, and try and get as strong a data profile out there as possible. So if you want to, invest in a fintech, or if you want to start a crypto company, you kind of want to know what those figures are for UAE or Qatar or for Nigeria for that matter. And that is not readily available. So that's one of the challenges that we're trying to solve at Lucidity Insights. But something that's more general for startup founders is this fundraising challenge. So everyone needs money. You got to spend money to make money, they say, right? And what we found as we built Lucidity Insights was, everyone is coming to us and saying, hey, you guys know a lot of the investors because we talk to them a lot. We also have a podcast called The Perfect Pitch, where I sit down with the region's most prominent venture capitalists. And I ask them, what makes a perfect pitch? What are you looking for in a founding team? What makes you write the check versus take on multiple meetings? And we get into the nitty-gritty of it. And we did that because all these startups were coming to us and saying, data is great, but we want funding. And we said, how can we help? And so on one hand, we've built this podcast and developed it so that we can get the advice from the experts, right? And I'm just the lucky host that gets to sit there and learn this stuff in real time. But on the other hand, we actually went about it and said, okay, we took some of those comments from the investors, and they said, I said, what's your biggest pet peeve? Why don't you give out the funding? Beyond if the idea is crap or the founding team isn't great. And they said a couple of things. They said, one, research. For example, if you're building a pitch deck, you want that data in there to be solid. Yeah. You also want research on the investor you're going to. You need to customize it, right? Unfortunately, in this part of the world and in every part of the world, even in Silicon Valley, there are a lot of people that try and knock on the doors of investors and just ask for a handout. That's not how fundraising works. There's a whole strategy to it. You have to build your pitch deck, your business case. Why are you the right founder in the right place? And why are you asking this investor to invest? Like, why them and not the other guy? And the first step in that is to, some people are calling us the Tinder of start for startups and investors.
Matchmaking. That makes it easy to understand, though.
Yeah. And that's because we built last year a tool called the Investor Matchmaking tool. And essentially, if you load your startup profile onto lucidityinsights.com, you can then identify who the right investors are. So you can dilute or, reduce the 750 investors that we have on our database, and then put in your profile what your sector is, what city, and as a hint for startups that are fundraising for the first time, don't go global. Like, some of them are trying to go after the big boys, right out of the gate. And you're like, no. Every investor says, get a local investor on board first. If you can't convince a local investor, you can't convince an international investor.
That's a great tip.
Yeah. So we built this database, and now we've built this entire platform to help startups basically do their research. Like, people think, oh, it's to matchmake. Well, yes, but that's kind of, if you do your research right, that should be the automatic byproduct.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is interesting, because I've had a few sort of initial phone calls with people who are, as in I'm in personal branding, but they need help with their personal brand because they want to either get investors or they want to sell their business.
Right.
And they've been... They have no visibility. It's they built the business, and they're understanding the power now of going, do you know what? Actually, they want to know about me. Why should they invest in me? Because there's, as much as
100%.
The product or the service has got to be amazing, you've got to want to work with that person.
Yeah. And let me tell you, this is the biggest mistake, besides not researching the investor you're pitching to. Yeah. The biggest mistake that startup founders make is that they spend all this time trying to convince the investor that their business is the right business. The reality is, the business can be the right investment and the right business, but if they don't like you, if they don't trust you, if they don't understand why you're running that business and why you would make it a success or a unicorn versus if I were running the business, then they will pass on it because they see the same business idea that you're pitching 100 times a year.
Yeah.
And so for them, it's so funny. In the later stages, of course, they're evaluating the business model. And it's, if you've already built a $100 million business, when investors are coming on at that stage, they're looking at what makes this business stronger than others. And it doesn't rely as heavily on the founder.
Yeah.
But if you've never raised funding, or if you're in your first 3-4 years, and this is kind of make or break, and you're raising fundraising to say, hey, we believe in your business and we believe you can do it, they're literally spending 90% of their time, if not 95% of their time, evaluating you as a founder.
Yeah.
And something else I learned this year, which I thought was quite interesting, is that the majority, this isn't not a blanket statement, but the majority of investors are looking for a founding team. And the reason behind that is pretty easy to understand, I would say.
Yeah.
A single person doesn't have all the skills that they need, right? And you would need a visionary founder. You need a visionary, person that has the skill set to maybe launch it. But that person, no matter, let's I don't know, take Mark Zuckerberg or whoever, fill in the blank with famous entrepreneur here. And you look at them, and the reality is that they just don't have the whole skill set that you need to
makes
build
perfect
that.
Sense.
Right? And the other side is they're looking for that collaboration factor. And so as bringing it back to the personal branding and visibility, I would say that's another common mistake. And I know we make that mistake at Lucidity Insights as well. Like we're helping promote education and all of this stuff. But actually, this is the first time we've ever done a podcast about what we're doing.
Brilliant.
So it's great for us to go out there. But I can really understand why startup founders don't want to spend the time doing that, because we're focused on building our business and our heads are down and we're tinkering in the back and we just assume that the product will do the talking for us. Yeah. But the reality is that we actually have to go out and promote it, make sure people know about it, make sure who's behind it so that people can trust the product that they're buying.
Yeah, I love that. And you mentioned pitching earlier on. I remember reading Vanessa Van Edwards' book called Cues, and her team did an extensive research on the Shark Tank in the US on who and how pitches were won.
Interesting.
And there was one example that she gave, and I thought was brilliant. And she had said in the pitches that had secured the funding, they had on average, it was something like 500 plus hand gestures in their presentation, and the least successful pitches had about 200 on average hand gestures. Wow. And I thought, so it's something as simple as engaging with a hand gesture in your presentation.
Crazy.
Is part of the pitch. It's all part of your personal brand. And I thought that was a really interesting way to put it, looking at something as commercial as Shark Tank or Dragon's Den. But there's so much you can learn about the study of those as well when it comes to winning an investment and not.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting fine line, because there is a slight performative angle to it, but there's also this desire for authenticity and honesty, right? Mm-hmm. And with specifically venture capital and private equity and any of these investors, this isn't like a one-time, a sponsorship package that comes and goes in 3 months.
Influencer deal. Yeah.
Right. These are long-term business partners that take a stake in your business. And so they all say, of course, do the little pony dance. And if you can rock that, great. You're going to get the second meeting and all of that. But there is also this long game that has to be played. And the other side of that coin is, okay, there's so many things we can focus on and perfect, right? And I think that's really important to do the cues and learn how to present and how to present yourself. But then there's also this element of, who are you? What are your values? How do you run your business? How are you going to communicate to your investors? How do you hold yourself accountable? And that's the key piece we have to also remember that when we fundraise for the first time, it's highly likely that these are the investors you have to convince for a second round of funding. Because if they don't come back on, your business dies.
And people will question, I suppose, why didn't they come back?
Absolutely. So people have to be founders have to be really careful about who they bring on. It's just like a marriage contract, it's long-term for life, and businesses have been made or broken based on the investors they've brought on.
Interesting. So has there any been like nice success stories or cool matchmaking partnerships that have happened? It's
so funny. I get asked this question all the time, and I kind of have a Tinder CEO answer to this, in that we don't sort of monitor the conversations between the VCs and the startups. We don't take a stake in any of it. Mm-hmm. So we don't know of any marriages yet, but we do know that there's multiple conversations going on. There's VCs that have come back to us and said, hey, can you hyper customize who can pitch to us as well? So we're doing some of that back end work for some of the VCs that are getting a lot of pitches on our platform. But what I can tell you is that we are facilitating meetings. There's some really interesting pitches that have found their way to VCs that they didn't even know about until they registered to Lucidity Insights.
I love that. I look forward to hearing about the first marriage.
Yeah, I hope so too. I would love. So if there has been a VC deal or a startup fundraising deal, this is a call out to them. We would love to hear from you.
I met my husband on Bumble, and I feel like I should message and say we have, because there's a marriage in that. I'm sure lots of people have as well.
I've met my partner on Bumble too.
Really?
This is a massive, we've been mentioning Tinder, but maybe we should be the Bumble of startup.
Absolutely. I think probably the next space, and I think something that is really important to bring into any business is the sustainability aspect. And I think when it comes to data, how would you describe that part of sustainability into the business journey? And then I want to go into, I've got another question off the back of that. So let's start with that one.
So yeah, really interesting about this angle. It's a passion subject of mine, particularly because when I first started out strategy consulting, I was actually a sustainability consultant. So that's how I broke into consulting before I went into the high growth, go-to-market strategies and that sort of thing. So I was one of the first sustainability strategy consultants in the region and worked with a lot of the governments here at a time where they didn't understand what sustainability was. In Arabic, they used to call it dharma, which is, kind of like green sustainability, like environmentalism, basically. And we had to try to convince them that it's not about hugging trees and saving the world, which is great. There's a place for that. But this is what we're talking about is the performance management, the integrated performance of environmental, social, and economic factors, and looking at your business from that holistic lens. And over the years, as I've moved a little bit away from that, I've always always taken on clients, even in my later years, around sustainability topics. And now in Lucidity Insights, we're really focused on climate tech, carbon capture, these startups in the mobility and electric vehicle space, for example. There's very specific tech verticals where technology is helping to solve some of our climate change issues. Now, that's the sustainability piece, but when we talk about ESG, and people always use them interchangeably, but ESG is environment, social, and governance. So they've sort of taken the economics and finance portion out because all businesses focus on that, de facto. And they've really focused on environment, social, and then the governance piece is actually this integrity piece. Like, how sophisticated is your business? Do you have a board of advisors? Do you have a board of directors? You do if you have raised funding. Startup founders regularly forget that if they take on funding, and this is why a lot of VCs say don't raise fundraising if you don't have to, you then inherit a board of directors of your investors that have a stake in your business, and they get to tell you kind of what you can and can't do. And there are global best practices for that. And so on our platform, I would say we should, I would love to do a better job of this, but we are trying to educate startup founders, especially at a later stage, on what good corporate governance looks like. And then in terms of environmental and social performance management, I would hope that all startup founders have this sustainability lens and they run their businesses in a way that mitigates environmental impacts, that maximizes positive social impacts and mitigates negative ones. I mean, that's my dream for the future, but I think the way that we're doing it at the moment is by highlighting successful startup stories where they're really making a beautiful social impact or an environmental impact and they're financially profitable. And by showing those success stories and showing those funds and VCs that are specifically investing in those, we're hoping that we inspire founders to integrate more of that into their business, or maybe their next business will be more of a social venture.
On that. What tip would you maybe have for an entrepreneur who's listening going, I need to be a bit more aware of that and I need to look at that? Not necessarily quick fixes, but what are things that people maybe just overlook and go, do you know what, that's something that you could implement?
Yeah, well, very quickly on the environmental side, this is becoming less and less now that we're working mostly with remote teams, but what is your environmental footprint? As a startup gets bigger, these are decisions that happen early on, and then as you get bigger, as you take office space, as you have, especially if you're a product manufacturer or logistics, for example, some people are sending out products. In the tech space, it's like, okay, specifically for tech, because I think those are the players that are listening in on us, it would be their energy footprint. So are you looking at how much energy is being used by your product systems, or your systems, and are you getting that through renewable energy? There are renewable energy server providers. Do you have that on those types of servers? Are you, for all of your business travel, whether you believe in carbon mitigation or not, I'm a huge proponent of it, and it's super cheap. If you're like, I'm a startup founder, I can't afford to buy carbon credits, it's so cheap. I travel around the world all the time, and then I put it into the calculator, and it's like an extra $20, to go to Canada, for example. So if you can do that, these are ways in which you can kind of offset the negative impacts you're having with some positive impacts. But, ultimately, I would just say read about. There's all of these guides. You can check out the GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, and they have sector-specific guides on what the biggest issues are, because there's different sustainability issues for different sectors. Yeah. And find one that suits you. And, obviously a bank has a very different impact on the world than it does on a mining company, for example.
Yeah, really, really, really useful. So we touched on teams there, and earlier you had said that investments, or when people are looking to invest, they actually want to invest in a team.
Yeah.
What would be your thoughts on building a great team at startup level, but also being hands-on, but also having the leadership perspective? What would be your tips in that space?
In terms of bringing on the right people?
Yeah, I think bringing on the right people, but also growing. Because I think you can bring them in and then you're like, hang on a minute, we're all kind of doing everything here in the startup phase. Because it's very different to when you've all got your specific roles further on.
Yeah.
How do you balance that maybe?
Yeah. It's interesting because, I've been reflecting on what some of my superpowers are. And one of my superpowers has always been this aspect about connecting with people, but also very quickly distinguishing and understanding what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses. And then how can we basically put you in a team to be a high performer. Essentially, that's what strategic consulting is, right? When we're flying into a new country and we're on the ground, we have to do a bunch of interviews. We're picking up the phone call and, doing site visits, and then building out financial models on one. And we're like a SWAT team for CEOs, right?
I have this vision of you landing in the helicopter on the ground and you.
Yeah, I wish it was a helicopter and that cool, but economy class, cattle class, coming into Indonesia or Pakistan or Malaysia, and then a bunch of business meetings, and then pulling all together and really gathering insights that way, and then figuring out what's really going on in the ground. And in that way, I think I was able to learn this very quickly. And I learned very quickly that how effective my tiny little SWAT team was, which was anywhere from 5 to 25 people during my consulting career. One bad hire or one excellent hire just changes the game. And it's the same even at Lucidity Insights. We're so careful in who we bring on. And if it's not working, it's not working. And we can be really jovial about it, but I do believe in radical honesty. I believe in, what we learned in Silicon Valley and at Stanford is fail early and fail often. Failure is not a negativity, but you should be glad when hopefully your CEO or your boss points it out in a really kind manner. It should always be done with love. But there's not enough people being honest in the workplace today, and those honest conversations really early on is what can make or break a business, and what can make or break you. You don't want to waste a year in a business where you're not performing well. So that's what I would say to that.
What's been the most honest conversation that you've had then that's had the biggest impact? That was maybe hard initially to think this is going to be honest, but it was the best thing you ever did?
There's so many. I live by this mantra of radical honesty, and I apply this to my personal life as well, which can be quite difficult sometimes, but usually it ends really well and better than I can imagine. And the conversation that comes to mind is with my co-founders sitting down and really having this honest conversation about one of our co-founders actually, who really didn't feel engaged in the role that they had signed up for, and how they wanted that to change. And that's what was hurting their performance. And then for me to also be honest about what it is that I'm willing to do and not willing to do for the business. And that has meant a reorganization. And it's also meant that I'm stepping back from a lot of roles in the business. I've taken a certain pay cut, which I think is reasonable, so we can disseminate that elsewhere. But these are difficult conversations to have where we go, hey, we signed something, we agreed on something 3 years ago. But there's some people that are not happy with the current situation, and it's actually causing an issue with everyone, even if it's subliminally. We need to bring it out to the table, have a conversation about it, and then let's figure out a way where everyone moves towards, well, first of all, away from what they don't want, and then towards what they do want.
So how would you define the difference between honesty and radical honesty?
Yeah, I find a lot of people say that they're honest. And so in that situation, the honesty piece would be, I'm not happy.
Yeah.
You know, something has to change. Yeah. And we see this in like relationships a lot too, right? But they're not specific. They're not specific about, you know, I've done a lot of self-reflection. I'm finding that I'm actually really demotivated and unhappy. And I'm also going to own the fact that I have not performed over the last 2 months. I haven't done X, Y, and Z, and this is why this is happening. And if I'm totally honest about it, these are all of the things that contributed to that. And this is what I ultimately want. And this is why I want that thing. And most of us are either too lazy or too fearful to have that discussion. And we need to do that in our relationships with our best friends. It doesn't apply to everyone, right? But I also tell this to venture capitalists all the time. I say, why don't, you know, one of the biggest issues is that you don't, I actually was on the CEF stage last year saying this, grilling a bunch of VCs on the panel. And they said, you know, we don't like to give feedback because startup founders are so passionate about their idea that it's easier for us to just say no and not give them a reason why. And I said, but you're doing a disservice to them, to you probably, because you're going to get a bunch of emails over the next few months, or they're going to go back and go, oh, I think it's this issue. And they're going to make up stories about what it is and then spend 6 more months on something that's never going to be a yes for you. And it's just better if you give them that tough pill now than for them to be super bitter about it a year and a half from now when you're like, you knew this a year and a half ago, why didn't you tell me?
And I think it's delivery as well.
It's 100% delivery. And again, I truly believe that we live in a world that's too fast paced. We're asking people to grow their businesses way too fast. I actually think there's real magic, and I've heard this from a lot of some of the best startup founders that I've really, aspired to. Even last year, sitting here with Shazam's founder, Chris Barton, he really talked about how they organically grew. And in this day and age, he wondered if they could have survived. Like Shazam would have probably died before anyone would have known about it. And the reason why they became who they were in 24 years was because they grew slowly and methodically, and they had, it was still like many, many near-death scenarios, but they had that luxury. And I truly believe there's real magic in that, because if you're moving really fast, it means you're moving with just your head, with just your mental capacity. And the reality of most really successful startups is that you're moving with your heart, you're moving with your intuition, you're moving with all of your faculties. And when you move too fast, you can't tune into what your heart wants. You can't tune into what your instincts want. And yeah, I would say it's, if I could, bring a slow startup building movement, like the slow food movement, I would. If you can, and if we live in a hustle culture, there's something magical about stepping back and really being conscious about what you're building.
I think that's a really nice thing to end on, because this hustle culture of it's got to be now, it's got to be here, it's got to be fast. Yes, there is that element that you'd said about feeling fast and failure is not an issue, it's not a problem, but there is also the other side of, I love the way that you put that.
Yeah, it's such a balance, isn't it?
Yeah. What would you say to Erika 16 years ago? What piece of advice would you kind of wrap up on now? Because I know that's hard because there's so much that's happened. But is there someone starting a business now? What do you wish you'd maybe known 16 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, different advice for any day that you ask me that question. But today and lately, what I've been reflecting on is that, as cliche as it sounds, everything does happen at its right time. Mm-hmm. And everything you do leads to whatever it is you're going to do next. Last year, I had a little moment of crisis, a personal crisis. A lot of startup founders, successful ones, say you need to have a very clear purpose about what you're doing. And I have a very strong spiritual practice. And there came a point where I have multiple businesses here in Dubai, and I was looking at them and going, I'm not sure if all of these align with my dharma, with my life's purpose. I don't see it. And I wasn't really sure what the legacy of all of this was. And I actually went on a very deep meditation retreat in Mongolia last summer. And the download that I got in those moments was not just every company that I've been a part of, not just every school I've attended, not just every lecture or person that I've met, but my childhood experiences, every little thing, even my spiritual practice, all of these things are part of your dharma and the part of your success in the future. And I can see that now coming out in Lucidity Insights. You brought up sustainability stuff. We're not really a sustainability platform, but my love for it, my years of experience have fed into that. And I think, honestly, a lot of our startups are a reflection of who we are. And so the longer we take to get there, that's okay as well. I think a lot of people think, I got to do it soon. And there are benefits of doing it young and dumb and naive, and there's a lot less financial pressures maybe, and you can take bigger risks. But I would actually say, take your time, enjoy the moments, know that everything you're doing, everything, every phone call, every PowerPoint you're creating, every person you run into will actually feed into whatever it is that you do next.
I love that. I think there's a Steve Jobs quote with that. You can only join the dots when you look back.
100%.
That would be exactly that you think, I did this and I did this, but actually because I did this allowed me to have the sustainability part in this business
100%.
Or whatever it is.
Or even I'll just say, I do think I'm a great team builder, and my current startup, I would say 4 of my most instrumental players on my team I've known for 10 plus years. And they came through different facets of life. Some I've worked with, some I met in different countries at different times. Some I randomly dated and then they became a friend.
Did you find them on Bumble too?
I think at the time it must have been Tinder, but yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, so everything has its own journey, and I think patience is a virtue that many of us have lost touch with.
Very well said. Well, I have loved speaking to you this afternoon. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your stories, the connections, and getting to know you a little bit more.
Thank you,
Great
Kelly.
insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I really appreciated it.